In September 1939, the defense of Lwów emerged as one of the most complex episodes of the September Campaign, shaped by both the German invasion from the west and the Soviet entry from the east. The geopolitical context of the interwar years had already made the city a strategically contested site. Located near Poland's southeastern border, Lwów was a vital administrative, cultural, and military center, housing key command posts, industrial facilities, and extensive railway networks that connected the country's heartland with the Carpathian approaches and the Romanian frontier. Its population of more than 300,000 included Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, making it not only a military objective, but also a city of symbolic and political importance. The German attack on Poland beginning September 1st brought the city into focus, though it was not among the Wehrmacht's initial primary objectives. Early German advances from Silesia and Lesser Poland cut through central regions, and as the campaign unfolded, Lwów gained prominence as one of the few large urban centers still in Polish hands. For Polish commanders, the city offered both a defensive stronghold and a potential staging point for retreating formations aiming to reach the so-called Romanian bridgehead, where regrouping and continued resistance were envisioned. By mid-September, German forces moving eastward through southern Poland converged toward the city. The 1st Mountain Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division pushed through the Carpathian approaches, while the 1st Panzer Division, having fought at Kraków and Radom, advanced toward Lwów's western approaches. These movements created pressure on Polish commanders to reinforce the city. General Władysław Langner, tasked with its defense, began organizing available troops, combining regular army units retreating from earlier battles with improvised formations made up of reserve soldiers, police, and volunteers. Lwów's defenses reflected both preparation and improvisation. Pre-war plans had envisioned some fortifications, but these were incomplete by 1939. The city relied heavily on the terrain advantage provided by surrounding hills, river crossings, and urban density. Engineers erected barricades, dug trenches, and positioned artillery in concealed locations. The defending force eventually numbered around 30,000, though it consisted of disparate elements, including remnants of the 10th Cavalry Brigade Fortress Artillery units, and improvised battalions formed from railway workers and students. Equipment was varied, with some modern artillery pieces and anti-aircraft guns, but shortages of ammunition and armored support limited sustained resistance. Public sentiment in Lwów reflected the broader uncertainty of the September campaign. Civilians had followed news of the German advance with growing anxiety, and the influx of refugees from western Poland swelled the city's population. Shelters, schools, and churches were filled with displaced families. At the same time, local authorities mobilized civilians for defense-related tasks, from building barricades to maintaining supply lines. Propaganda emphasized determination and solidarity, though privately many feared encirclement and devastation. The Soviet Union's entry into Poland on September 17th altered the city's strategic context dramatically. While German forces pressed from the west, Soviet units of the Ukrainian front under General Ivan Tyulenev advanced from the east, crossing the Polish border with the stated aim of protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. For Lwów, this meant that instead of serving as a gateway for retreating Polish units, the city risked becoming the focal point of a two-front confrontation. Polish intelligence received scattered reports of Soviet forces approaching, but uncertainty about their intentions complicated decision-making within the command. Internationally, the defense of Lwów was followed with limited clarity. Communications between Polish command and allied governments in France and Britain were disrupted, and expectations of Western intervention were already diminishing. For Germany, capturing the city would symbolize consolidation of the campaign and secure vital communications in the south. For the Soviet Union, establishing control over Lwów would underline its claim to eastern Galicia, fulfilling provisions of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Thus, the preconditions for the defense of Lwów reflected not only tactical realities, but also broader geopolitical shifts. The city stood at the crossroads of German and Soviet ambitions, defended by a mixture of organized troops and improvised units, supported by a population already strained by refugees and shortages. By mid-September, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only test the endurance of the Polish defenders, but also reveal the complexity of fighting two invasions simultaneously. The opening phase of the defense of Lwów began in mid-September 1939, when German formations advancing eastwards first made contact with Polish defenders on the approaches to the city. By this time, Poland had already endured 2 weeks of rapid German advances across much of its territory, with the Wehrmacht exploiting armored spearheads, close air support, and encirclement tactics. As the German 1st Mountain Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division pressed forward from the Carpathians, and the 1st Panzer Division maneuvered through southern Poland, the city of Lwów emerged as a focal point for both sides. Polish forces were still in the process of organizing when the first German probes arrived at the outskirts on September 12th. General Władysław Langner, appointed commander of the defense, relied on a combination of regular units retreating from earlier engagements, fortress artillery, and ad hoc battalions drawn from police, railway guards, and volunteers. At this point, the defenders numbered roughly 20,000 to 25,000, with reinforcements expected as remnants of the 10th Cavalry Brigade and other units attempted to fall back toward the city. Their immediate priority was to establish defensive perimeters and prevent German reconnaissance elements from seizing key positions around bridges, hills, and railway junctions. The German approach combined speed with probing assaults. On September 12th to 13th, elements of the 1st Panzer Division launched attacks to test Polish defenses at Grodek Jagiellonski, about 30 kilometers west of Lwów. Polish forces, though under pressure, managed to halt these attacks temporarily with artillery fire and stubborn infantry resistance. Refugees moving eastward passed through these lines, bringing alarming stories of German tanks, air raids, and the collapse of other defenses. Civilians within Lwów responded by digging trenches and reinforcing barricades, with municipal authorities ordering blackout measures to reduce the risk of bombing. German air operations played a significant role in this phase. The Luftwaffe bombed railway stations, warehouses, and transport hubs, aiming to disrupt Polish supply efforts and demoralize the defenders. On 12 September, an air raid struck the city center, damaging residential districts and causing civilian casualties. Despite anti-aircraft fire, the Polish defenses could not prevent German aircraft from operating at will, though weather occasionally reduced their effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Polish command attempted to consolidate. The arrival of retreating formations bolstered the city garrison, raising its strength to around 30,000 by September 14th. These forces included fortress artillery units with heavy guns, which were placed in key positions to cover approaches and deter tank assaults. Improvised armored trains and small groups of tanks added limited mobile support. Communication, however, remained problematic. Many units entered the city disorganized, lacking reliable supply chains or clear coordination with Langner's headquarters. Ammunition stocks were already strained, and food supplies were threatened by the influx of civilians. From the German perspective, Lwów presented both an opportunity and a challenge. Capturing the city would secure the southern flank of the advance and cut off Polish retreat routes to the Romanian bridgehead. Yet street fighting was expected to be costly, particularly given the defenders' artillery and the density of the urban terrain. German commanders therefore sought to encircle the city, using infantry and armor to cut roads and railways leading in and out, rather than launching a full assault immediately. By 14 to 15 September, German units had succeeded in surrounding much of the western and southern approaches, though the eastern side remained open, allowing Polish forces to continue receiving reinforcements. For civilians, the opening phase was marked by uncertainty. Many attempted to flee eastward, joining columns of refugees on overcrowded roads. Others stayed, either compelled by necessity or reassured by Polish officials that the city could withstand siege. The atmosphere combined determination with fear, as residents witnessed the arrival of both retreating troops and wounded soldiers from previous battles. By 16 September, Lwów was effectively under siege on multiple sides, though Polish forces still controlled routes toward the east and southeast. The opening engagements had shown that the defenders were capable of delaying German advances and inflicting losses, but the city was increasingly isolated. As German pressure mounted and reports of Soviet movements from the east began to reach the Polish command, the defense of Lwów entered a more complex phase, one that would soon draw in not only German forces but also a new and unexpected front. Strategic planning for the defense of Lwów in September 1939 was shaped by a convergence of urgency, limited resources, and the shifting realities of the broader campaign. At the Polish command level, General Władysław Langner was tasked with preserving order inside the city and preventing its premature fall. His staff faced the challenge of integrating a patchwork of forces, retreating regular units, fortress artillery, improvised battalions of reservists and police, and volunteer groups drawn from civilians. By mid-September, these forces numbered around 30,000, but their cohesion and supply situation were far from ideal. The strategic aim was twofold: hold the city as long as possible to tie down German divisions, and, if conditions permitted, use it as a rallying point for units retreating toward the Romanian bridgehead. The Polish High Command, already fragmented by the rapid collapse of defensive lines across the country, recognized that Lwów could not be permanently held. Yet the city's defense was seen as valuable for both military and symbolic reasons. The longer it resisted, the more difficult it would be for German forces to redeploy southwards against Polish concentrations in Volhynia and the Carpathian foothills. Langner's staff therefore sought to create layered defenses, outer lines in surrounding hills and forests, fortified positions at bridges and railway stations, and a core defensive ring inside the city itself. Engineers reinforced barricades, dug trenches across main avenues, and positioned artillery to cover likely German approaches. Anti-aircraft batteries were concentrated around key installations, though the Luftwaffe's numerical superiority meant they could only inflict limited disruption. On the German side, strategic planning focused on swift reduction of the city without becoming bogged down in prolonged street fighting. The 1st Mountain Division, trained in difficult terrain operations, was assigned to press from the south and southwest, while the 1st Panzer Division and supporting infantry divisions approached from the west and north. Their objectives were to cut off all access routes to the city and compel surrender through encirclement, bombardment, and psychological pressure. The German High Command viewed Lwów as a secondary target compared to Warsaw, but nevertheless a necessary conquest to secure communications and ensure no major Polish concentration remained in the southeast. Logistics played a decisive role in these calculations. Polish defenders faced dwindling supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition. The influx of refugees strained available resources further, creating shortages even before the city was fully encircled. Hospitals filled quickly with both civilian and military casualties, forcing authorities to improvise medical care. German forces, by contrast, enjoyed more stable supply lines, though advancing deep into Galicia created its own challenges. Roads were overcrowded with military columns and refugees, and fuel demands of mechanized units required careful management. Still, German control of the air and secure rear areas allowed them to sustain pressure on the city. Propaganda accompanied these military preparations. Polish radio broadcasts from Lwów emphasized resilience and portrayed the city as a bastion of national resistance. These messages aimed to maintain morale within the population and assure allies abroad that Poland continued to resist. German propaganda, meanwhile, portrayed the encirclement as inevitable and sought to induce surrender by highlighting the futility of resistance. Leaflets were dropped over the city, warning civilians of destruction if the defense continued. The Soviet entry into Poland on September the 17th forced a radical re-evaluation of strategic goals. For Polish commanders, news of Soviet advances from the east complicated the plan to hold Lwów until a breakout toward Romania could be organized. Instead, they now faced the likelihood of being trapped between two converging powers. Langner's immediate objective shifted from sustaining prolonged resistance to negotiating how best to preserve his troops in a deteriorating situation. German planners, for their part, recognized that Soviet forces would soon arrive and pressed to accelerate operations around the city, to claim victory before their new partner could. This phase of strategic planning revealed the limitations facing all sides. Polish commanders sought to hold Lwów with inadequate resources. German divisions aimed to capture the city without committing to costly urban warfare, and the Soviet advance created an unpredictable third factor. The defenders' layered fortifications and determination could buy time, but the strategic context increasingly pointed to an outcome dictated not only by battlefield performance, but also by geopolitical decisions unfolding far beyond the city walls. The first major clashes around Lwów began between the 12th and 16th of September, when German forward elements attempted to seize control of approaches to the city. These initial confrontations set the tone for the siege that followed, revealing both the strengths of the Polish defensive posture and the immense challenges posed by the Wehrmacht's mobility and firepower. While the defenders succeeded in delaying German advances and inflicting losses, the city quickly became the focal point of converging attacks from multiple directions. German strategy in these first engagements was to encircle Lwów before committing to a direct assault. The 1st Mountain Division pushed in from the south and southwest, exploiting routes through the Carpathian foothills. Its infantry encountered stiff resistance from Polish defenders entrenched in villages and forests, who used artillery and machine gun nests to slow their advance. On the western side, the 1st Panzer Division pressed forward, its armored spearheads aiming to cut railway junctions that connected Lwów to Przemyśl and Tarnopol. German infantry divisions followed, consolidating positions and securing supply routes. The Luftwaffe, operating with relative freedom, bombed bridges, roads, and communication lines, intensifying pressure on both military and civilian infrastructure. Polish defenders responded with coordinated, if improvised, countermeasures. General Władysław Langner directed fortress artillery units to cover key approaches, particularly those leading to railway lines and bridges over the Piotew and Poltwa rivers. Heavy guns positioned on the surrounding hills proved effective in slowing German tanks, forcing them to disperse and avoid predictable routes. Small detachments of Polish tanks, mostly 7TP light tanks and older models like the Renault FT, were deployed sparingly, used to support infantry rather than launch independent operations. Cavalry brigades, including elements retreating from the Bzura counteroffensive, dismounted and fought as infantry, reinforcing weak points in the defensive line. The early clashes were not limited to purely military engagements. Civilians were immediately drawn into the conflict. Refugees continued to pour into the city, creating overcrowded conditions and disrupting military traffic. Municipal authorities organized work details, mobilizing men and women to dig trenches, erect barricades, and prepare shelters. School buildings were converted into hospitals, and railway workshops were used to repair damaged equipment. At the same time, German bombing raids struck residential districts, causing casualties among non-combatants and heightening anxiety. These attacks underscored the dual role of the population, as both supporters of the defense and victims of the escalating conflict. German assaults intensified on September 14th to 15th, when armored columns sought to breach the western perimeter near Grodek Jagiellonski. Polish artillery and anti-tank weapons, though limited, managed to halt several tank thrusts, knocking out vehicles at close range. Reports noted that Polish infantry, entrenched in fields and woods, repelled repeated assaults, demonstrating the defensive value of terrain and fortifications. However, such successes came at the cost of high casualties and ammunition depletion. In some sectors, entire companies were reduced to a fraction of their strength, forcing commanders to shift reserves constantly to plug gaps. Despite these setbacks, German forces steadily tightened their grip. By 16 September, they had cut most of the western approaches, severing reliable links with central Poland. The northern routes were threatened, and only the southeastern corridor remained open for reinforcement or withdrawal. Inside Lwów, the defenders adjusted their strategy to focus on urban defense. Barricades were erected at major intersections, tram tracks were torn up to create obstacles, and machine gun positions were established in prominent buildings. Artillery was moved into concealed courtyards, prepared to fire on advancing German units once they entered the city streets. Morale during these first engagements was mixed. For Polish troops, early successes against German armor and the ability to hold defensive lines fostered determination. Yet the scale of the encirclement and the relentless pressure from air attacks eroded confidence in long-term survival. Civilians displayed resilience in supporting the garrison, but the influx of wounded and the destruction of supplies created a growing sense of crisis. For German forces, the resistance was stronger than anticipated, requiring repeated assaults and higher expenditure of ammunition and fuel than planned. Commanders recognized that while the city would eventually fall, its defenders were capable of prolonging the struggle. Unexpectedly, the first engagements also highlighted coordination and problems within the German command. The 1st Panzer Division, advancing rapidly, at times outran its supporting infantry, leaving tanks exposed to Polish ambushes. Communication difficulties across difficult terrain slowed the pace of encirclement. This gave the Polish defenders breathing room, allowing more troops to withdraw into the city and bolster its defenses. For the Polish command, each day gained was valuable, as it bought time for regrouping and, in theory, for a potential breakout toward the Romanian frontier. The situation grew more complex after September 17th, when news of the Soviet invasion reached both Polish commanders and German units. This development altered the meaning of the first clashes around Lwów. What had begun as a struggle to hold off the Wehrmacht now appeared as a defense caught between two advancing powers. For the German army, the Soviet advance provided additional urgency to complete the encirclement and capture the city before their allies arrived. For the Polish defenders, the news created uncertainty, whether to continue holding the line, attempt to negotiate, or prepare for a dual-front conflict. By the close of this initial phase, Lwów remained in Polish hands, but its situation was precarious. German forces had surrounded much of the city. Civilians were under constant threat from air raids, and supplies were dwindling. Yet the defense had not collapsed. Instead, the first engagements demonstrated the defenders' capacity for improvisation, the effectiveness of terrain and urban fortifications, and the willingness of both soldiers and civilians to resist. This set the stage for a longer siege, one that would soon be complicated by the arrival of the Red Army and the question of who, ultimately, would claim control of Lwów. The escalation of the siege of Lwów unfolded between September the 17th and 20th, 1939, when the battle transitioned from probing assaults into a prolonged and multifaceted crisis. What had begun as a German attempt to capture a major urban center developed into a siege involving continuous bombardments, infantry attacks, and growing civilian hardship. This stage also coincided with the dramatic entry of the Soviet Union into the war on September 17th, further complicating the strategic outlook for the defenders. German commanders, recognizing the resilience of the Polish garrison, intensified their efforts to encircle and reduce the city. The 1st Panzer Division expanded its control to the northwest, while the 1st Mountain Division pressed in from the south, and infantry divisions moved to close the eastern and northern corridors. By August 18th, Lwów was surrounded on almost every side, with only narrow, contested routes toward the southeast remaining partially open. The Luftwaffe escalated its bombardments, targeting railway stations, fuel depots, and warehouses, while artillery batteries shelled defensive positions continuously. Civilians bore the brunt of this escalation, as shells and bombs struck residential districts, damaging water and power supplies. Casualty numbers among non-combatants rose sharply, adding to the humanitarian crisis already created by the influx of refugees. For the Polish defenders, escalation meant a shift from delaying actions to full-scale urban defense. General Władysław Langner concentrated his forces within the city perimeter, organizing defensive sectors and assigning commanders to key strongpoints. Fortress artillery and anti-aircraft batteries were moved closer to the center to avoid being overrun, while infantry units dug into barricaded streets, parks, and industrial zones. Cavalry units fought dismounted, supplementing infantry with mobile reserves that could shift between threatened areas. Ammunition shortages became severe, artillery fire was rationed, and infantry units conserved their small arms ammunition for close engagements. Nevertheless, Polish units managed to repel multiple German infantry assaults on the western and southern edges of the city between the 17th and 19th of September, inflicting notable losses and buying more time. Civilian involvement in the defense expanded further as the siege intensified. Thousands of residents worked on fortifications, cleared rubble, and assisted in transporting supplies to frontline units. Women and children staffed improvised medical stations, tending to both soldiers and civilians wounded by bombing. The strain on the city's infrastructure became critical. Hospitals overflowed, food distribution broke down, and clean water supplies were disrupted. Epidemic fears grew as sanitation collapsed. Yet morale, though under great pressure, was sustained by determination to resist, supported by Polish radio broadcasts that continued to transmit appeals for unity and confidence. Politically and militarily, the Soviet invasion radically altered the context of the escalation. News of Soviet forces advancing into eastern Galicia on September the 17th reached Lwów by September 18th, throwing Polish command into uncertainty. General Langner and his staff now faced the prospect of fighting two simultaneous enemies. The original plan, to hold Lwów until retreat to the Romanian bridgehead was possible, was rendered unrealistic as Soviet forces cut into southeastern Poland and blocked escape routes. For many defenders, the question became whether the city should be surrendered to Germany, to the Soviet Union, or continue to resist until conditions forced a decision. German commanders were equally affected by the Soviet advance. Orders from higher command emphasized the need to capture Lwów quickly before Soviet forces could reach it. On 19th September, German units intensified artillery bombardments and attempted multiple infantry assaults along the northern and western sectors. The fighting was intense, with Polish units inflicting losses in close combat and using fortified buildings to hold back attackers. At the same time, German negotiators attempted to pressure the Polish command into surrender, dropping leaflets and broadcasting loudspeaker messages promising humane treatment of civilians if resistance ceased. The Soviet entry into the scene became tangible on September 19th to 20th, when reconnaissance elements of the Red Army began to appear on the eastern outskirts of Lwów. Units from the 24th Rifle Division under the command of the Ukrainian front reached positions near the city. This presented a new dilemma. While the Germans continued their assaults from the west, Soviet forces demanded the city's capitulation to them as well. Polish commanders received conflicting messages, as German and Soviet representatives each insisted that the city should surrender to their forces. For Langner, the escalation had thus become a political as well as military crisis, with the lives of his soldiers and the fate of the city hanging on negotiations between two converging invaders. Civilians in Lwów experienced this stage as the most destructive and chaotic yet. Bombing raids destroyed entire districts, fires spread through residential neighborhoods, and food shortages became acute. Panic was reported in some quarters, though most of the population continued to support the defense through labor and aid. Refugees who had hoped to use Lwów as a safe haven now found themselves trapped within a besieged city, their chances of escaping dwindling with each passing day. For many, survival depended on the outcome of negotiations that were increasingly beyond the city's control. The escalation of the defense of Lwów thus combined intensified German military operations, growing civilian suffering, and the sudden appearance of Soviet forces. The defenders faced a dilemma without precedent, fighting against two powerful adversaries, each demanding surrender, while striving to maintain cohesion and order inside a city under siege. This stage revealed the extent to which Lwów's defense was not only a military engagement, but also a diplomatic and humanitarian crisis, caught at the intersection of two invading armies whose coordination and rivalry determined the city's fate. The peak of the defense of Lwów occurred between the 20th and 21st of September 1939, when German assaults reached their highest intensity, and Soviet forces appeared in full strength outside the city. During these days, the siege transformed into a struggle fought simultaneously on the battlefield and in negotiations, as all sides recognized that the outcome would determine not only the fate of the garrison, but also the symbolic control of southeastern Poland. German commanders committed significant resources to a final effort to capture the city by force. The 1st Panzer Division launched repeated thrusts into the western suburbs, supported by artillery barrages designed to weaken barricades and demoralize defenders. Infantry battalions pushed into fortified villages and industrial districts, encountering stiff resistance at every turn. Polish fortress artillery units, though critically low on shells, continued to inflict losses, destroying several armored vehicles at close range. Improvised barricades of tramcars, sandbags, and rubble slowed German tanks, forcing them into narrow streets where they became vulnerable to grenades and anti-tank rifles. At key intersections, Polish infantry held their ground despite overwhelming firepower, often retreating only after exhausting their ammunition. The Luftwaffe also intensified its role, bombing military positions and civilian areas alike. On 20th September, major air raids struck the city center, destroying warehouses, damaging churches, and setting fire to residential blocks. Anti-aircraft batteries downed a small number of aircraft, but could not prevent widespread destruction. Civilian casualties rose sharply, with hundreds killed or wounded in a matter of hours. Fires burned uncontrolled in several districts, adding to the chaos. Yet, despite the devastation, Polish radio continued broadcasting from concealed transmitters, reporting that the city still stood and encouraging defenders and civilians alike to endure. Inside the city, the strain of the peak fighting was evident. Hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilians, with corridors and basements filled beyond capacity. Food supplies dwindled further, with bread and potatoes distributed in minimal rations. Water shortages became acute as pipelines were cut by bombardment. Civilians improvised by drawing water from wells and rivers under dangerous conditions. Despite these hardships, morale remained surprisingly resilient, sustained by a determination not to capitulate to German forces. Civilians and soldiers alike interpreted the defense as a matter of preserving order and dignity, even if ultimate victory was impossible. The arrival of the Soviets shifted the dynamics dramatically. On 20th September, units of the 24th Rifle Division, advancing as part of the Ukrainian front, reached the eastern outskirts of Lwów. Soviet representatives sent envoys demanding that the city surrender to them, presenting themselves as liberators of the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. This created confusion within the Polish command. General Władysław Langner faced simultaneous pressure from German negotiators, who demanded unconditional surrender, and Soviet envoys, who promised more lenient terms if the city capitulated to the Red Army. Langner hesitated, seeking to preserve his forces and avoid destruction of the city, while also aware that the Polish government had not authorized cooperation with either invader. For the Germans, the Soviet arrival was both an obstacle and an opportunity. The Wehrmacht command understood that under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Eastern Galicia fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. This meant that even if they succeeded in capturing Lwów militarily, they might soon be obliged to hand it over. German commanders therefore pressed harder to force a quick Polish surrender before Soviet control was fully established. Yet the presence of Soviet forces also created leverage, as both invaders could use the threat of destruction to pressure Langner into capitulation. On the battlefield, this rivalry produced a peculiar situation. German and Soviet troops avoided direct clashes with one another, focusing instead on hemming in the Polish defenders. For Polish soldiers, the prospect of fighting Germans on one side and Soviets on the other was demoralizing. Rumors circulated about Soviet treatment of captured Polish officers and the implications of surrendering to either side. Some officers preferred continued resistance against the Germans, fearing Soviet captivity more. Others argued that Soviet surrender might save civilian lives and prevent further destruction of the city. These debates reflected the unprecedented nature of the crisis. Rarely in modern history had a city faced simultaneous siege demands from two different armies. Civilians at this stage endured the most difficult conditions of the siege. Streets were filled with rubble, food was nearly exhausted, and the constant presence of artillery fire made movement dangerous. Refugees who had crowded into Lwów from surrounding regions were now trapped, unable to leave, and dependent on dwindling supplies. Families sought shelter in cellars, often spending days without light or fresh air. Yet many continued to support the defense, carrying messages, preparing meals for soldiers, and helping extinguish fires. By 21st September, it was clear that the defense could not continue indefinitely. German attacks, though costly, had cut deeper into the defensive perimeter, and the Soviet presence made relief or escape impossible. Langner faced the stark choice of continuing resistance, which would likely mean annihilation of his forces and destruction of the city, or seeking surrender terms from one of the besieging armies. Negotiations intensified, with German envoys demanding immediate capitulation and Soviet representatives offering to accept surrender under their control. The defenders still held significant portions of the city, but the peak of the fighting had shown that they could not withstand sustained pressure from both enemies simultaneously. Thus, the climax of the defense of Lwów was not only a military struggle, but also a diplomatic standoff. German and Soviet commanders sought to outmaneuver one another to claim the city, while Polish leaders weighed the survival of their troops and population against the impossibility of further resistance. For civilians, these days represented the height of suffering, bombardments, starvation, and uncertainty about which foreign power would soon occupy their homes. The peak phase revealed both the determination of the defenders and the limits imposed by geopolitics, setting the stage for the decisive negotiations that would soon bring the siege to an end. As the siege dragged into its second week, the defenders of Lwów entered a phase of resistance and adaptation that reflected both determination and desperation. By September 21st to 22nd, 1939, General Władysław Langner and his staff recognized that no relief force could reach the city, and that continued fighting against both the Wehrmacht and the advancing Red Army would be unsustainable. Nevertheless, within the walls of Lwów, Polish soldiers and civilians improvised ways to prolong resistance, preserve cohesion, and maintain some measure of control over their increasingly dire situation. One key element of adaptation was the reorganization of defensive lines. With ammunition stocks dwindling, Langner ordered a concentration of forces around core sectors of the city, abandoning some outer positions that could no longer be held effectively. This allowed the Polish command to reduce frontage and conserve manpower. Barricades were reinforced with additional materials taken from trams, furniture, and demolished buildings. In several districts, defenders dug communication trenches between blocks to enable movement under fire. These adjustments gave Polish units greater resilience against renewed German assaults, though at the cost of ceding ground and exposing more civilians to bombardment. Resource management also became critical. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that some infantry units were limited to a handful of rounds per rifle. Soldiers were instructed to engage only at close range and conserve grenades for urban combat. Artillery pieces, once central to the city's defense, were now largely silent, with only a few shells held in reserve for emergencies. Food shortages became acute. Rations were reduced to minimal portions, and bread, potatoes, and occasionally horse meat provided the bulk of sustenance. Civilians lined up at improvised distribution points, while soldiers often shared their rations with refugees. The water supply, disrupted by bombardment, forced residents to draw from wells or rivers, risking exposure to shellfire. Psychologically, both soldiers and civilians had to adapt to the strain of encirclement. For defenders, the knowledge that they were isolated between two converging enemies weighed heavily. Rumors circulated about the treatment of Polish prisoners by Germans and Soviets alike, fueling debates over which adversary posed the lesser danger. Officers worked to maintain morale by emphasizing discipline and order, presenting resistance as a duty rather than a path to victory. Civilians adapted by developing daily routines despite the chaos, cooking meals in cellars, organizing childcare in shelters, and volunteering for tasks such as carrying messages or caring for the wounded. These acts of normalcy provided a measure of stability amid destruction. Tactically, Polish defenders continued to launch localized counterattacks to disrupt German advances. On 21 September, small groups of infantry and cavalry conducted night raids on German positions in the western suburbs, destroying vehicles and delaying assaults. Improvised armored trains, operating on surviving sections of track, shelled enemy positions before withdrawing into the city. These actions had limited strategic effect, but demonstrated continued resilience, complicating German plans for a rapid capitulation. For German troops, the persistence of Polish resistance underscored the difficulties of urban warfare against determined defenders, even when supply and communication advantages lay with the attacker. The arrival of the Red Army further shaped adaptation strategies. Soviet reconnaissance units now appeared openly on the eastern outskirts, and their presence created a complex dynamic. Langner and his staff considered whether it might be preferable to surrender to the Soviets rather than to the Germans, reasoning that the city could be spared further destruction if negotiations proceeded quickly. To prepare for this possibility, Polish commanders began restricting active engagements with Soviet units, focusing their limited resources on German assaults. This selective adaptation revealed the growing role of diplomacy alongside military defense. Civilians also adjusted their behavior to the new reality. Some began to conceal valuables in anticipation of occupation, fearing confiscation by whichever power ultimately entered the city. Others sought to maintain neutrality, avoiding open demonstrations of loyalty to either side. Yet a significant portion of the population continued to support Polish defenders, driven by solidarity and the hope that resistance might secure better terms in eventual negotiations. By 22nd September, the defense of Lwów had become less about holding ground and more about sustaining order in the face of collapse. The Polish command adapted by preserving the integrity of its units, managing dwindling resources, and exploring diplomatic options. Soldiers and civilians alike endured the hardships of siege with remarkable resilience, even as the inevitability of surrender became clear. This phase of resistance and adaptation highlighted the capacity of a besieged population to improvise and endure under extraordinary strain, while underscoring the limits of what could be achieved once two powerful armies pressed in from opposite directions. The turning point in the defense of Lwów came on September 22, 1939, when the confrontation shifted decisively from armed resistance to negotiations as Polish commanders faced the impossibility of holding the city against two converging enemies. Until this point, General Władysław Langner and his staff had balanced military defense with the hope of eventual relief or breakout. But by late September, it was clear that no external assistance would arrive. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the population faced devastation if the fighting continued. On the battlefield, German forces pressed relentlessly from the west and north. Artillery bombardments continued to pound defensive lines, reducing barricades and causing mounting casualties among both soldiers and civilians. Infantry advances probed into the suburbs, testing Polish resolve and keeping defenders under constant pressure. Yet by this stage, German commanders were increasingly aware that Lwów lay within the Soviet sphere of influence under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Their goal was to compel a rapid surrender before the Red Army could claim the city. But negotiations between Berlin and Moscow dictated otherwise. Orders from higher command discouraged full commitment to urban combat, reflecting the broader geopolitical arrangement that Germany would eventually withdraw from this area. Simultaneously, Soviet forces arrived in strength on the eastern approaches. Units of the 24th Rifle Division and supporting formations of the Ukrainian front deployed outside the city, presenting a clear alternative to German siege operations. On 22 September, Soviet envoys contacted the Polish command, insisting that Lwów surrender to the Red Army. They argued that Soviet forces had entered eastern Poland to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, and that further resistance was futile. This message was delivered through both formal channels and propaganda broadcasts, contrasting with German ultimatums that demanded unconditional capitulation. Inside the city, the Polish leadership faced an unprecedented dilemma. Langner convened his staff to consider options: continue resistance against both armies, surrender to Germany, or surrender to the Soviet Union. Continued fighting promised only destruction. A German capitulation risked harsh treatment and possible reprisals, as German bombing had inflicted severe damage and civilian casualties. Surrender to the Soviet Union was uncertain, as their intentions remained unclear, but some officers believed that Soviet terms might spare the city from further devastation. After debate, Langner leaned towards surrendering to the Soviets, reasoning that this would prevent additional destruction and perhaps offer more favorable treatment for civilians. Civilians themselves experienced 22nd September as a decisive change. Rumors spread rapidly that negotiations were underway, raising fragile hopes that bombardments might cease. At the same time, fear of occupation deepened. Families hid valuables, fearing confiscation, while many worried about reprisals for assisting in the defense. Some residents hoped that Soviet entry would bring stability after weeks of siege. Others feared political repression. The uncertainty underscored the gravity of the turning point. The city was no longer fighting to survive, but preparing to endure life under foreign control. The formal negotiations began late on the 22nd of September, with Polish representatives meeting Soviet envoys. The Soviets demanded unconditional surrender of both military forces and the city administration. Polish negotiators attempted to secure guarantees for the safety of civilians, the protection of property, and fair treatment of prisoners of war. German representatives, though still present around the city, were excluded from these talks by prior agreement between Berlin and Moscow. This exclusion reflected the shifting nature of the siege. While German troops had borne much of the fighting, the Soviets were poised to take possession. For the defenders, the turning point was both practical and symbolic. It marked the end of organized resistance in Lwów, and the acknowledgement that the city's fate was no longer determined by its defenders' courage, but by international agreements and the presence of two powerful armies. By nightfall on the 22nd of September, fighting had largely ceased as Polish commanders prepared for the formal surrender to Soviet forces the following day. Thus, the turning point of the defense of Lwów was not a dramatic final battle, but the recognition of inevitability, shaped by the convergence of German and Soviet armies and the collapse of any hope for relief. The decision to surrender to the Soviets rather than the Germans reflected both military pragmatism and geopolitical realities, and it signaled the transition from siege warfare to occupation. For soldiers and civilians alike, this moment represented the close of one struggle and the uncertain beginning of another. The aftermath of the defense of Lwów unfolded rapidly after the decision to surrender to Soviet forces on September 22, 1939. On the morning of September 23rd, General Władysław Langner formally signed the act of capitulation with representatives of the Red Army, handing the city over to Soviet control. By this agreement, Polish forces inside Lwów were to lay down their arms, with assurances given by Soviet envoys that officers and soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war according to international conventions. In practice, however, the situation developed in ways that reflected the harsh realities of occupation and the broader consequences of the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. Polish units assembled in designated areas, stacking rifles, machine guns, and artillery under the supervision of Soviet officers. Estimates suggest that more than 20,000 Polish soldiers surrendered in Lwów, including regular army units, fortress artillery crews, improvised battalions, and civilian volunteers. Officers were separated from rank-and-file soldiers, their future uncertain. While enlisted men were often released after brief internment or redirected into forced labor detachments, officers were detained and transported to camps deep within Soviet territory. Many of these officers would later become victims of the Katyn massacres carried out in 1940. The German army, despite having fought to encircle and bombard the city, withdrew from Lwów in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Units of the 1st Panzer Division and 1st Mountain Division pulled back westward, ceding control to the Red Army. This abrupt withdrawal left German soldiers resentful, as they had borne the brunt of the fighting, but did not receive credit for capturing the city. German records noted frustration at being forced to hand over hard-won positions, though higher command emphasized adherence to agreements with Moscow. For the civilians of Lwów, the immediate aftermath of surrender brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. The cessation of bombardments ended the destruction and loss of life caused by German artillery and air raids, and daily survival seemed less precarious. Shops reopened cautiously, food distribution resumed under Soviet oversight, and fires were extinguished in damaged districts. Yet the population quickly realized that the new authorities would impose radical changes. Soviet administrators introduced strict controls. Property belonging to the Polish state, banks, and major enterprises was seized. Political organizations were dissolved, and press outlets were censored or shut down. Refugees who had crowded into the city during the siege found themselves trapped by new borders. Many who had hoped to move south toward Romania or Hungary were blocked by Soviet patrols. Others attempted to blend into the population, fearing deportation or arrest. Within weeks, Soviet authorities began mass deportations of civilians deemed politically unreliable, including former officials, landowners, and intellectuals. Families were uprooted and transported to remote regions of the USSR, marking the beginning of a long period of repression. For the Polish military tradition, the surrender of Lwów was bitter. Soldiers had fought effectively against German assaults and maintained order under extreme conditions, only to be compelled to capitulate not to enemy they had been resisting, but to a new invader. This outcome highlighted the tragic situation faced by Poland in September 1939. Caught between two powerful neighbors and unable to influence its own fate. The loss of Lwów deprived Poland of a major cultural and administrative center, symbolizing the dismemberment of the state. Internationally, the aftermath of the defense of Lwów confirmed the practical effects of the secret agreements between Germany and the Soviet Union. Foreign observers noted that, while German propaganda celebrated the campaign's overall success, it was Soviet troops who entered and occupied Lwów. Reports reaching Western Europe and the United States underscored the reality that Poland had been partitioned, with little possibility of regaining independence in the immediate future. The humanitarian situation remained dire in the weeks after surrender. Thousands of wounded soldiers filled improvised hospitals, now under Soviet control. Civilians sought to rebuild homes damaged by bombardment, though shortages of materials and the imposition of Soviet economic policies slowed recovery. Fear of political repression overshadowed relief at the end of combat, as arrests, deportations, and executions became part of daily life under occupation. Thus, the aftermath of the defense of Lwów was characterized by the end of fighting, the transition to Soviet authority, and the onset of a new phase of hardship for soldiers and civilians alike. The capitulation spared the city from further destruction, but it ushered in an era of occupation that would reshape its political, social, and cultural landscape. What had begun as a determined defense against the German invasion ended in surrender to another power, highlighting the complex and tragic dimensions of Poland's September campaign. The legacy of the defense of Lwów in September 1939 occupies a distinctive place in the history of the Polish campaign, shaped by its unique circumstances of fighting against two invaders and surrendering to one of them under geopolitical constraints. Unlike Warsaw, which fell after a direct German siege, or Modlin and Hell, which resisted until the very end of September, Lwów's experience was defined by the simultaneous presence of German and Soviet forces, a situation that revealed the full consequences of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Militarily, the defense demonstrated the resilience of Polish forces under extreme conditions, with around 30,000 troops supported by fortress artillery, remnants of field units, and improvised formations. The city resisted sustained German pressure for more than a week. Defenders repelled armored thrusts, delayed infantry advances, and organized effective barricades in urban terrain. These efforts showed that even in a deteriorating strategic context, Polish command could still coordinate disciplined defense. Yet the legacy also underlines the limitations imposed by logistics, ammunition shortages, lack of air cover, and the impossibility of resupply doomed the defense regardless of tactical successes. For Germany, the battle was a reminder of the costs of urban warfare. The 1st Panzer Division and 1st Mountain Division expended significant resources and suffered losses in attempting to capture Lwów, only to be ordered to withdraw in favor of Soviet occupation. This created frustration among German officers and soldiers, who saw their battlefield efforts negated by political agreements. The episode reinforced the perception within the Wehrmacht that the September campaign was not solely a matter of military efficiency, but also of diplomatic arrangements between Berlin and Moscow. For the Soviet Union, Lwów represented an early demonstration of its claim over eastern Galicia. By accepting the city's surrender, the Red Army established control over one of the most important urban centers in the region, The occupation was followed by rapid political and social transformation. Soviet authorities dismantled Polish institutions, suppressed independent organizations, and initiated deportations of civilians and imprisonment of officers. The defense thus became the prelude to a long period of Soviet rule, punctuated by repression and cultural change. Civilians experienced the defense and its aftermath as both a tragedy and a turning point. The bombardments caused destruction, displacement, and loss of life, while shortages created hardship. Yet the participation of civilians in constructing defenses, supporting the garrison, and enduring the siege left a memory of shared resilience. The subsequent Soviet occupation overshadowed these efforts, introducing fear and repression. For many families, the defense of September 1939 was remembered not as an isolated event, but as the beginning of a cycle of suffering under successive occupiers. Historically, the legacy of Lwow's defense has been debated. During the Second World War, the Polish government in exile emphasized the city's resistance as an example of determination against overwhelming odds, even though surrender was ultimately forced by circumstances beyond the control of its defenders. In post-war communist Poland, the narrative shifted, with official histories framing the Soviet entry as liberation and downplaying the complexities of the dual siege. After 1989, renewed scholarship brought greater attention to the diplomatic context, the role of both German and Soviet forces, and the human dimension of the siege. In the broader history of the September campaign, Lwów stands as a symbol of Poland's geopolitical predicament. The city's defense highlighted that Poland's military could resist effectively on the tactical level, but no tactical success could overcome the reality of facing two coordinated great powers. Its surrender to the Soviets, rather than the Germans, underscored the extent to which the fate of Poland was determined by external agreements rather than battlefield outcomes. Commemoration of the defense of Lwów has taken different forms. Monuments and memorials in present-day Lviv recall the events, though perspectives vary depending on national and local contexts. For Polish memory, it represents the sacrifice of soldiers and civilians caught between two invaders. For Ukrainian perspectives, the episode is often viewed through the lens of the region's subsequent incorporation into the Soviet Union. Internationally, the battle is remembered as an illustration of how the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact operated in practice, with direct consequences for cities and populations on the ground. Thus, the legacy of the defense of Lwów lies not in victory or defeat in the conventional sense, but in its demonstration of the limits of resistance under overwhelming geopolitical pressure. It remains a reminder of the complexities of September 1939, a city defended with determination, surrendered under duress, and subjected to occupation that reshaped its history for decades to come.